morning, everybody. We'll be getting started in just a minute, just letting everybody join. If you could please stay on mute throughout the event, and then we will have time for questions at the end. Okay, so I will get started. So welcome to our first online event as Holocaust Centre North. So we have become, from the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre, as you know us, we are now Holocaust Centre North. And we're proud to announce that this event is in partnership with Remembering Srebrenica UK. So I'm Hannah, and I am the Head of Learning at Holocaust Centre North, and I am joined by Lucy from Remembering Srebrenica, and we'll hear from her soon. Tonight's event brings together three academics to think about the legacies of both the Holocaust and the war in Bosnia, including the ethnic cleansing regime, the effect on society, education, and the individual, and then we will consider how we can combat genocide denial. I would like to introduce our wonderful panel. First up, we are joined by Dr. Chelsea Sambells, Head of Research and Partnerships at Holocaust Centre North and a Research Fellow at the University of Huddersfield. Her expertise is understanding how governments and NGOs treat refugees and children during war and genocide, and tonight she will be considering how the Holocaust influenced the establishment of human rights and international law, and in turn, how this affected what happened in Bosnia. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Dr. Linda Asquith, who is course director of the BA in Criminology at Leeds Beckett University, and her specialism is victimisation and state harms. Tonight, she will be speaking on how survivors of genocide rebuild their lives in new countries and how they are supported to do so from those countries. Welcome, Linda. By no means least, we are joined by Dr. Maria O'Reilly, also from Leeds Beckett University, where she is Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations. Her work focuses on gender politics of war and peace, in particular looking at the region of the former Yugoslavia. Tonight, Linda will be focusing on the post-war peace processes and the important role of survivors of genocide within that. Each speaker will speak, and then we will have a panel discussion led by Lucy before opening up to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions throughout, please place them in the chat and I'll be monitoring them. And as you're aware, we are recording the event tonight. But without further ado, I would like to hand over to Chelsea, who's going to start us off tonight. Over to you, Chelsea.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. And we'll get it going. Okay. Hannah, can you see my screen?
Yep, all good.
Good stuff. Well, good evening, everyone. It is my great privilege to speak on this panel alongside such expertise with everyone here tonight about the legacy of the Holocaust. I'm going to look at how the Holocaust transformed our concepts of human rights and how that led to broader changes for future genocides, particularly Srebrenica. And I'm going to start first with a little short brief history of international law before the Holocaust. It might come as a bit of a shock to you that before the outbreak of the Second World War, most citizens, particularly in the West, were subject to the laws of their nations, but not to international law. This is a subtle but critical difference, and I'm just going to explain it. The 1907 Hague Conventions, which were some of the very first international laws that had direct relevance to the Holocaust, actually defined civilians and other groups, such as prisoners of war, as very different. In both the First and Second World Wars, this equated to entirely different treatment between civilians and POWs. For example, sending and receiving post, which remains a cornerstone of human rights today, was not granted to interned, displaced, or detained civilians, but instead these rights existed for just POWs. The Third Geneva Convention in 1929 expanded the rights of POWs, including the coordinated relief of prisoners, whereby properly accredited individuals monitored camp operations and distributed relief. In practical terms, this meant that POW camps in the Second World War were regularly inspected by Red Cross officials, whereas concentration camps were not subject to humanitarian inspections. but the Third Geneva Convention again neglected to define civilian rights. Aha. Then again, in 1934, the world came very close to providing civilians international rights at the 15th International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies held in Tokyo. But as you guessed it, the Tokyo draft was not signed or implemented with any legal authority before 1939. Thus, by the outbreak of the Second World War, there were no international laws to protect civilians in war. In fact, as the Holocaust has shown, POWs received much better treatment than those in the concentration camps. This also meant that Nazi Germany could create any laws it wished to remove the rights of its citizens, such as Jews, without any real repercussions from the international community. And then, of course, history unfolds. The worst genocide in modern history occurs, which is now called the Holocaust, and eventually the Axis powers are defeated. The international victors decide to hold a big trial at Nuremberg. So, the International Military Tribunal, comprised of judges from France, Britain, America, and Russia, presided over the legal hearings of 22 of Germany's highest ranking Nazis in the first and most publicized trials. And just a note that there was another 12 trials held after the International Military Tribunal, IMT, which persecuted doctors, judges, lawyers, loads of industrialists and other Nazis, which I won't get into today, but those are actually called the Nuremberg Trials, and this is the IMT. Importantly, the IMT argued that even though international law for civilians did not exist before the war, that Germany was actually still subject to a small part of the Hague Convention called something called Martin's Clause. This essentially states that inhabitants and belligerents remain under the protections and rules of the law of nations and the laws of humanity. Very important. This gave the judges legitimacy to conduct a trial against Nazi perpetrators. Many of you will know that this court, the IMT, came up with 4 categories of crimes, famously including crimes against humanity. They also used survivors' testimonies for the first time as evidence in exploring the atrocities undertaken in the German zones of occupation and the camps. For example, we have Marie-Claude Vaillant Couturier. I've had to practice that. She was part of the French resistance. She became a photojournalist after the war and later a French politician for the Communist Party. And she arrived at Auschwitz in 1942 with 230 other French women, but only 49 survived. And it's very interesting watching the court proceedings, which you can do to this day. I love technology, where you can see her being questioned about arriving at Auschwitz. And she explains that she had come and only 49 had ever made it back to France. And the judges stop her and say, oh, you mean 49 arrived with you in Auschwitz and 49 went back to France? And she said, no, 230 French women arrived and only 49 made it back to France. And she says it in English, and you can hear an audible gasp across the courtroom. And it's the very first time that they've recognized, that the court has recognized the severity and the low survival rates coming out of Auschwitz. She noted that she and her compatriots sang La Marseillaise to keep up the courage when entering the camps. She talked about the brutality, the violence, the dogs, the disease, the infirmaries, the forced abortions of inmates, the degradation, the malnutrition. She talked about everything. She also gave testimony against Klaus Barbie, who is the butcher of Lyon, in 1987. And while the IMT and the Nuremberg Trials sought to punish these criminals for their cruel treatment of civilians by using such important survivors' testimonies, it actually achieved so very much more. There was a dramatic legal and conceptual transformation that internationalized human rights. And importantly, it eliminated that subtle but critical difference discussed earlier, where individuals were no longer just subject to the laws of their nation, but subject to a higher authority of international law that guarantees their human rights. This had an enormous impact on everything that came after, including Srebrenica. In 1948, the very first concept of human rights was created by the United Nations, which finally closed that gap whereby civilians, no matter what country they came from, had basic rights in war. And these included right to relief and aid from any party or government. And when detained, civilians must be given food, water, and allowed to communicate. The sick and wounded had a right to receive assistance. Medical workers must be allowed to do their jobs. And belligerents are prohibited, never allowed, from causing various things upon civilians, such as violence or mutilation, torture, murder, rape, corporal punishment, etc. Importantly, as a result of these Geneva Conventions, genocide also became a crime. It might seem ridiculous to think that genocide had never been outlawed before 1948, but there were multiple genocides that occurred before the Holocaust. The Armenian genocide, and we could even draw this to parallels to things like colonialism and slavery. These acts were defined later as when governments or political groups undertook actions with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. After the collapse of communism in the 1990s, when suppressed nationalism of multiple ethnic groups was unleashed in places like the former Yugoslavia, the United Nations investigated evidence of war crimes for the first time since the Nuremberg Trials. Notably, rape was recognized as a crime against humanity for the first time in the aftermath of the Bosnian Civil War. So let's talk about Srebrenica a little bit. In July 1995, the Bosnian Serb army entered a UN compound with little, if any, resistance by the Dutch peacekeepers who were meant to be in charge. They separated out women and children, loaded them on buses. Many of these women and children were raped afterwards. And then they took all the men ages 16 to 60, although I've also heard was as young as 12 and as old as 70, to the nearby forests where they tortured and killed them. This continued for days and nights. At night, Bosnian Serb soldiers and paramilitaries dug out the bodies from the mass graves and dispersed them across a very large area, sometimes even to tertiary graves. This particular disposal technique meant that many bodies were never recovered or identified. The broader conflict at that time also meant that an estimated 140,000 people lost their lives and tens of thousands more were displaced because of this violence. The International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia was established in May of 1993, and it persecuted the largest number of people for crimes by a single institution ever in history. In fact, the court was only dismantled in 2017, which is incredible. Unlike the Nuremberg Trials and the IMT, it was deliberately meant to not be a victor's trial. Madeleine Albright at that time was very particular about this. It was meant to be far more democratized, involving many other nations. As a result, it was also the world's first truly international court, comprised of judges from China, Malta, the Netherlands, Italy, the United States, South Africa, Germany, and the Bahamas. From a legal perspective, the clear intent to murder Bosniak men and the chain of events that led to the Srebrenica massacre meant the ICTY deemed the events at Srebrenica as a case of genocide. This was further ruled as genocide by the International Court of Justice in 2007. What's really important to point out, though, about the ICTY was its focus on the individual perpetrators. Similar to Nazi perpetrators, many in the Bosnian War claimed that they were simply following orders. The ICTY dismantled that argument by using the evidence of over 4,000 witnesses who gave harrowing testimony about individual perpetrators based upon their individual experiences. This too underlines a major change in Holocaust scholarship, which has sort of been shifting for the last sort of 10, 15 years, whereby experts are moving away from the idea that genocide is this industrialized, mechanized, and almost inevitable process towards highlighting instead the choices and decisions that individual perpetrators would make to injure or kill within wartime contexts. But that's not to say that the ICTY was a flawless system of justice. For example, the legal process extended into the decades. On the 24th of March 2016, Radovan Karadzic, the former Bosnian Serb leader nicknamed the Butcher of Bosnia, then aged 71, was found guilty of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity for his actions in Srebrenica. He was also sentenced to 40 years imprisonment, more than many other Nazi war criminals from Nuremberg. Additionally, despite the ICTY's authority in indictments of criminals, there is rising denial that Srebrenica should be classed as a genocide. Similar to Holocaust denial, this is due to the motivations of certain nationalist or right-wing groups who want to deny or minimize such crimes as a way to weaponize that historical narrative for their own purposes, for example, to highlight Serbian victimization. But interestingly, in July of 2021, Bosnia's criminal code was amended to criminalize the denial of genocide, which is really interesting. This provoked right-wing groups to commission reports, remarkably including some Israeli Holocaust scholars, to help refute the ICTY's decision that Srebrenica was genocide. But doing so is very damaging, particularly if some scholars argue that the Holocaust is somehow exceptional or incomparable to any other mass atrocity, including Srebrenica. This then means that genocide somehow exists external to the normal human experience rather than as a tragic, but often feasible reality for many people in violent contexts, even today. Whether Srebrenica is or is not a genocide is part of this ongoing debate today, not only in Serbia, but also in broader discussions of the meaning and histories of genocide. One of the ways we can combat such genocide is through court proceedings and evidence, as boring as that sounds. This is also why survivors' testimonies are so very, very valuable. For example, the Nuremberg Trials court proceedings for the IMT's court proceedings taking place over 10 months or 210 days, all had to be translated into 4 languages, right? This resulted in 42 volumes of published transcripts and the nickname, The Trial of 6 Million Words. Today, you can access all 6 million words online. It's incredible. And you could read for days, years with all this stuff. Similarly, the ICTY's proceedings took place over 10,800 days and included 2.5 million pages of transcripts. Today, you can access every single one of these transcripts online. Amazing, an incredible resource. And this is important because no one today can claim ignorance to the atrocities or the scale of these particular genocides or the experiences of survivors, even if they might disagree with how they are legally classified or how it might minimize other victim groups' suffering. So to summarize, the legacies of the Holocaust clearly have a marked impact on the justice sought after Srebrenica. These include the idea that civilians have indisputable human rights, that genocide is a crime, that criminal courts should strive to be democratic and international in their creation and composition, and that the importance of survivors' testimonies are critical to administering justice. Sadly, this does not mean that the international criminal justice system is flawless, obviously, nor has it deterred governments from committing mass atrocities as we see today in Ukraine or Western provinces of China. But the ethical responsibility of studying genocide also involves the ethics of comparison and ensuring that we continue to raise awareness about it in every segment of our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. That was really interesting. I would like to hand over to Linda now.
I'm just getting the camera working. Oh, let me see. Share screen, that's the one. Share that. Hopefully you can see that. Excellent. So I'm talking about life after genocide. So it's actually surprisingly a very positive area to look at when thinking about genocide. Most people think that when I talk about genocide that I'm just going to be depressed all the time, but actually this was a really positive experience to go through it and find out all these things about how people have developed their lives afterwards. So I'm going to talk about 2 particular areas, and that is the response and rebuilding. So I'm going to talk about the denial of experiences and re-victimization, and then also survivors and acculturation and how they resettle in a new country. So starting off with those denial of experiences, I've got a number of quotes here that illustrate a number of issues. And this was from Kitty from Poland. And she talked about how When she got to England, she was told that she shouldn't talk about her experiences by her uncle. And she said that everybody in England would be talking about personal war experiences for months, even years, after hostilities had ceased. But we who had been pursued over Europe by the mutual enemy and come close to extermination at the hands of those enemy, were not supposed to embarrass people by saying a word. And this requirement to keep quiet is quite common in a lot of survivors' testimonies when they talk about their life after the genocide, that particularly for those people who went to live with family who lived in another country, that they didn't really want to know about it, and particularly after the Holocaust, because everybody had been through what they saw as a victimizing experience because they'd been bombed out of their homes, they'd lost family members. It was a sort of a way of saying, we're going to move on from that. You know, we've had enough of that. We need to move on. We need to rebuild. So Holocaust survivors in particular found it very difficult to talk about their experiences, even if they wanted to, because of this denial of experiences that, well, you know, I'm sure things were bad. And one survivor said to me that he was telling someone about his experiences and didn't really go into much detail, but kind of gave a brief overview. And the person who was from England said, oh, yeah, we had it really bad here too, because sometimes you couldn't get cigarettes for weeks. So there's a lack of understanding about people's experiences and what they'd been through. And that denial meant that for those survivors who tried to talk, they decided to just not talk and just try and get on with their lives without disclosing, because the response to them was really not good. And then Judith from Poland also made this point that we weren't accepted as being survivors initially. It was the camp survivors and which camp you were in and whatnot. And it was interesting in that it's hard to explain. It's not because we weren't accepted as survivors. In a way, it made our experiences have no validity. And so there seemed to be this almost a hierarchy of survivors, in that those at the top were those that had been in the camps, the well-known camps like Auschwitz, and those who were seen as lesser survivors were those who may be hidden in forests or wherever, or had managed to get out during the war and escape to other places. So people on the Kinder transport, which brought 10,000 children and young people to England, was very much seen as, well, you didn't really survive, did you? Because you got out before the war started. So there's these hierarchies of survivors, and that's something that comes from survivors themselves as well as outside, where there'll be sort of tensions over who's the survivor, who's the most survivor in the group. And that was seen in a number of different cases, but particularly at a Holocaust survivors centre in North London, where there was a sort of debate about, you know, you didn't survive anything because you came here before the war, and those types of things. And so there's those ideas about either not talking because the reception is, well, you're not going to get heard because, well, everybody had war stories and everybody's lost someone. And that's an interesting one as well, because when you look at the creation of Auschwitz Museum, they recognised that telling an individual story didn't really go anywhere because everybody had lost someone. So they needed to tell the story of the mass death rather than individual stories. Now that narrative has changed somewhat, and certainly at the Imperial War Museum in London and other places, they tell individual stories because it helps us to understand the experiences and sort of align ourselves to those people, because people my age and you know, younger than me certainly, didn't live through the war, and so we don't have that same experience. And then there's also the element of re-victimization as people arrived in the UK. So Henry from Austria, who was a Kinder transportee, said that when he arrived, because he'd come from Austria, which was annexed by Germany, he was labelled as what was termed then as enemy alien. And so he had to go to the police to be registered, and he had to go, there was a curfew, and he had to be inside by 11 p.m, which wasn't something that everybody had to do. And whenever they moved house, if they changed jobs or anything like that, they had to go to the police and notify them of that change. So they were very much monitored by the criminal justice system, by the police. And so that felt very difficult. And also because of the labelling of enemy aliens, it kind of identifies them as something other, which is also problematic. So that's kind of a very brief overview of the sort of experiences that people had when they arrived. There's all sorts of other experiences, but those are the main ones in terms of their experiences just not being recognised and seen as anything different to what everybody else experienced. And that kind of grew in some ways with the later genocide, so Rwanda and Bosnia, where people just didn't have an understanding of what it meant. So we knew there was a war in Bosnia, we knew there was what seemed to be a war in Rwanda. And because of the lack of recognition by the international community, particularly in Rwanda, where it took them so long to admit that there was a genocide going on, that most people had been killed by the time they actually said the word, that there was no real understanding of what people had been through. And sometimes the responses in that way can effectively re-traumatize people. And one of the ways that we can help people once they've arrived in the country is through particularly education and employment. And so that's unsurprising. We know that education and employment helps everybody, but it's particularly important to people who've experienced genocide because it helps them recover and rebuild their lives. So Shafiq from Bosnia talked about when he arrived, he was a young schoolboy. And he was part of the Bosnia project that brought over a number of survivors in their family groups and tended to house them together as well. And he said that at school, his little group of survivors, his little group of Bosnian people would get together, they'd learn English together. So they had extra English lessons at school. And that helped them bond together as a group, but also helped them communicate with other people as well. And that helped because they could talk about their experiences with their group. They didn't need to talk about them in some cases because everybody had been through something similar and understood it. But also it meant that they were learning how to communicate with the host population, because one of the key aspects around genocide is the fact that we don't really, they don't have time to prepare. So it's not like they're a normal migration where you might start learning the language, you might start thinking about where you're going to live. This is also very rushed, very sudden. And, you know, English is not necessarily spoken as a language in all over the world, despite our efforts during the empire to just colonize the entire place. So English, learning a language, wherever it may be, whether you're moving to France or wherever, is really important. And Halima said that in terms of employment, she wanted to get her dignity back. And part of that was being employed and having a job and feeling that she was contributing some way. And Halima was a doctor in Darfur and had horrific experience in Darfur, but she wasn't recognised as a doctor in the UK. So instead, she couldn't work, so couldn't reclaim that dignity in that way, and ended up living on handouts from the Home Office, which were incredibly small and meagre and actually basically of poverty level handouts. And also saying that her story was lies as well. So she had this dual thing of basically her experiences being denied and at the same time not being able to contribute to society that she wanted to. She wanted to work, she wanted to be a doctor, but those qualifications, her social capital wasn't recognised in that way. One of the other aspects which I found really interesting is sports. So sport is incredibly useful in helping people settle in. And we kind of know that when we think about children going to a new school, that joining a football team, or if they move to a new area, joining the local football team or whatever is really helpful. But it was incredibly helpful for survivors as well. So Jack from Hungary started swimming, and because he was a good swimmer, he managed to get some kudos that way. And that sort of cemented his reputation in his group of boys because, he's a really good swimmer. We'll talk to him. And Shafiq as well found, because they lived in a small area in West Yorkshire, there was a football pitch nearby. And because they'd lived together as survivors as well, they basically started playing football on the pitch, and then they set up a football team, and they would meet there and train, and they had help from local people as well. So there was a real linking of the local community with survivors. So helping them set up the club, doing all the sort of admin type of things and what they needed to do, organising matches with other local clubs. And again, sport's really good because as long as you know the rules, it doesn't matter if you can't speak the language of the country. So as long as you know the rules of football, the offside rule or whatever that is, then it's really helpful because you can play that match. You don't need to be able to communicate. And actually physical communication in terms of hand signals often does quite well. So that sort of thing really helped people bond and settle down. And whether that's, going to a local park run or joining a football club or a swimming club or something like that is incredibly helpful for survivors. The other aspect, unsurprisingly, is family. And Kitty talked about the need to rebuild a family. And it wasn't just about having people around you. It was about basically responding to what happened and saying you didn't win. And Kitty particularly came to this conclusion after she'd been training to be a nurse and would be living in nurses' accommodation, and they were basically chucked out over Christmas because that's what they did. And she was homeless then, because that's where she'd been living. So she ended up spending Christmas Day and Boxing Day just walking the streets of London and sleeping in Snow Hill railway station overnight. And she was walking past all these houses with their lights on and people giving gifts and eating lots of food. And it was that really reinforced that she was never going to be that lonely again. So she wanted to create that family because so much of her earlier family had been destroyed. So she wanted to rebuild that family so she would never, ever be alone again. And there's also elements there as well in terms of not with Kitty, but other people responding to that threat by becoming risk takers and taking more risks, because there's almost an element of, well, I didn't die during the genocide, so I'm immortal. And one guy actually basically told me his friend was an appalling driver. And it's basically because he said, well, Hitler didn't kill me, so what is going to kill me? And so his driving was terrible, which I experienced, which is a whole other story. But it's those ideas of the trauma has impacted them to the point that they feel invincible afterwards as well. And then also independence, because of the way people were targeted during genocide. Judith said because her parents were so overprotective, because of what they'd experienced during the war, Judith went the other way because she just assumed that she was going to lose everything. So therefore, I will be independent. I don't need anybody else because I will lose them and that will hurt me. So I don't need anyone else. So she made her children very independent as well. And she said she didn't really get close enough to her children. And her approach was nothing lasts forever. They must be independent because I might die at any point. I might not be here. So they've got to be independent. And Lily as well talks about being a risk taker. I think because she was just having survived, and married so young as well, she married very young, she was going to experience, she was going to live, and she was going to have this amazing life. And she did have a brilliant life, and she's still having a brilliant life now. But that taking of risk, that almost the freedom of not being under threat means that they just want to experience everything all at the same time. And that independence can also, that sort of response to the Holocaust can almost go the other way as well. So one other survivor I spoke to, Ruth, talked about how, because she was a Kindertransportee and separated from her parents, that she never wanted her children to experience that loss and separation. So when her son had to go into hospital, she campaigned to be allowed to stay in the hospital with him, which was completely not a thing back in those days. So she led that movement towards parents being able to stay with children because she understood how abandoned she felt as a young person. She was about 4 when she first came over to England with her brother who was 7. And she just lost contact with her family. She managed to actually meet back up with her mother after the war, but the relationship had been fractured to such a point that she never really rebuilt her relationship with her mother, because her mother took her back to Germany, where she felt completely alien because she'd lost all her German speaking. She couldn't speak anything like that. She was speaking English, but also she'd been subjected to the British narrative of the Germans, which was nasty Nazis in jackboots hiding around street corners, that sort of thing. So she got taken back to Germany after the war and absolutely terrified of Germans because of our propaganda in the UK. So the impact of genocide, it can have really wide-ranging impacts, and it's not that everybody experiences it in the same way, but that we know that some things such as employment, such as sport, such as education can really help. So because I'm fast in Yorkshire, I've talked very quickly, but that hopefully gives Maria plenty of time and also plenty of time for questions as well.
Thank you, Linda. That was great. Really resonated with the stuff that we hear from our survivor community as well. And then, over to Maria.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Hannah and Lucy, for inviting us to take part in this tonight. It's a really fascinating presentation so far. I'm going to try and share my screen. Just
please do, because I can't try and stop sharing mine.
Let's see if this will work. Is that working okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Actually, I can't see it on my screen. Let me just, sorry, 1 second. I'm not sure what's happening, but I'll just start and see if I can move the presentation forward. It's showing up strangely on my computer. Anyway, so sorry for the delay. Yeah, today what I wanted us to do, or what I wanted to do, was really to use the time to highlight the important role that survivors are playing in terms of post-war peace building. So I'm going to talk today about Bosnia and Herzegovina and about the wider region of the former Yugoslavia. And what I'm going to argue is that rather than viewing survivors of genocides and of war crimes solely as victims, it's really important for us to recognise the very active roles that survivors play in post-war peace-building efforts too. And I'm going to look at one example of where survivors have played a really important role in peace building and in promoting justice as well. So that's the Women's Court for the former Yugoslavia, which was a grassroots regional truth-telling initiative, and it involved activists and survivors coming together to really create a different approach to justice and to try to take an approach which would help to build sustainable peace in Bosnia and in the wider region of the former Yugoslavia too. And when I'm using the term peace building tonight, I'm thinking here about the wide range of tools, the different ways in which people try to address legacies of war. So it's not just about addressing the immediate impacts of war, but also thinking about longer term efforts to try to build a culture of peace as well. There we go. Does that move forward to the next slide? Excellent. So it's great that Chelsea's already introduced the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That's fantastic. So as you've already heard, the Yugoslav Tribunal was really important in terms of holding to account individuals who were responsible for war crimes, who were responsible for crimes against humanity and for genocide too. And it's also an important institution because it established facts surrounding crimes that took place during the wars in the former Yugoslavia. The judgments that have been written and produced by the tribunal, they're a really important resource which are being used to challenge genocide denial and denial of other atrocity crimes today. But there are some limitations, I would say, with using criminal justice mechanisms to try to deal with the past. And there's also limitations when we think about the connection between justice and peace building as well. So, yeah, just to mention some of the kind of limitations of criminal trials and perhaps why other approaches are also needed too. If you look at how many people end up being prosecuted for various crimes, it's relatively few. So just zoning in on crimes of sexual violence, which people have become more aware of. I think it was only something like 32 individuals who ended up being convicted of sexual violence offences at the Yugoslav Tribunal. So that's very few when you think about the number of crimes that took place, the number of victims affected too. And when you look at criminal justice through the lens of gender, there's also limitations because we can see that women are actually less likely to testify as witnesses in criminal trials too. So again, in the Yugoslav Tribunal, it was only 13% of witnesses who are female. The vast majority of witnesses were male, 87% of those who testified before the tribunal. And trials are also not particularly victim-centred or survivor-centred either. So that a lot of people have documented the fact that witnesses can find testifying to be something which can be disempowering or re-traumatizing, especially when they're being cross-examined or their evidence is being challenged in court. And a final kind of limitation that I'll mention is that it's only those harms that fall into legal categories of criminal offences which end up being prosecuted too. So if there are losses, harms, acts of violence which don't meet the category of genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, then those aren't prosecuted, they aren't recognised either. And so that's meant that you have activists and researchers arguing that perhaps there are other forms of justice which are needed, which are more responsive to survivors' needs and survivors' interests. So some people have been arguing that we should have bottom-up and survivor-centered justice mechanisms, that these are necessary to try to acknowledge survivors' experiences and also promote their recovery as well. So delivering justice through the courts, through tribunals, has got limitations. And another approach, an alternative approach, is to try to build justice from below. And that's where the Women's Court initiative comes in. So that's a very different approach to justice, and it involves grassroots actors creating a space where women in particular, their experiences of violence and injustice are made visible. And those are experiences that are often hidden away. So what was the Women's Court for the former Yugoslavia? I'll just give you a bit of background, a bit of information on this initiative. So it was created by women's organisations and survivors of war-related violence from across the region of the former Yugoslavia. And it's an example of women coming together, women from civil society coming together to create an informal truth-telling mechanism. The Women's Court took place in Sarajevo back in 2015. There were 4 days of public events, and on 2 of those days there were public hearings as well. And at those hearings you had 36 women who testified in person about the violence that they'd experienced, the injustice that they'd also experienced during the wars in that region or after the wars as well. And those witnesses came from all of the Yugoslav successor states as well. So this was a regional initiative, and it included survivors of the genocide in Srebrenica as well. Some of those women testified. There were around 500 people in the audience, and the idea was that the Women's Court created a new kind of platform, a space to try to promote wider recognition, social recognition of survivors' experiences of victimization. And it also was trying to spotlight or highlight the kind of the extent to which women were able to kind of challenge militarism, challenge nationalism, challenge war as well. Their resistance to war also came through strongly in their testimonies too. So this is quite a different approach to justice. So I'll just highlight a few ways in which the Women's Court is quite different to criminal trials, to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And one of those differences is that this is women from the grassroots coming together, survivors associations, people from civil society coming together to organise proceedings. And the idea is that peace building and justice processes should be driven by people at the grassroots, and that women should be part of those processes too. Survivors also took on really important roles in terms of preparing for the court and organising the court too. So the Association of Mothers of Srebrenica and Žepa Enclaves, they were part of the regional board that organised the event. And survivors also took part in the preparatory process that took place several years before the event too. So you had survivors helping to decide on where the court would take place, which themes the court would highlight, which would focus on, and so on. And the idea is that survivors are really playing an active role in these proceedings. They're not taking a passive role in terms of they're not having justice delivered to them. They are part of this process. They're helping to drive it forward. Another feature which makes this initiative different is that these are designed as women-only hearings. So we know that a lot of the violence that women suffer in war, it tends to be underreported in trials and in other mainstream mechanisms like truth commissions too. And women are also underrepresented when it comes to, who ends up taking part as judges, as witnesses, as lawyers in mainstream justice mechanisms as well. So by using women-only hearings, the idea was that we're creating a space for survivors to testify, for women to testify, and we're also making sure that women participate fully and meaningfully in these justice mechanisms too. Another reason why this initiative is quite different is that this is an attempt to really localize justice. So the Yugoslav Tribunal is based in The Hague. It's outside of the countries that experienced war, whereas the Women's Court Initiative was held in Sarajevo. The preparations happened in the wider region. And the idea is that you're holding the proceedings in the country where crimes took place, rather than outside of that context. And that's quite important because it allows the organisers to design this initiative in a way which is a bit more sensitive to local context and survivors' needs as well. Something else which was quite different is that the hearings were not limited to just discussing harms that fall into these legal categories I've already mentioned. So there's an effort really to highlight the different types of losses, the different harms, the different forms of violence that women experience, the injustices that they experience as a result of war, and in peacetime too. So that was something quite different. And this model is quite informal as well. So unlike criminal trials, the Women's Court was quite an informal process. It relied on lay people getting involved rather than legal experts. And that meant that the court didn't have the power to sanction perpetrators or to award reparations. But what it could do was it was able to recognise the harms that women experienced, and it aimed to promote a more kind of restorative approach to justice compared to criminal trials. So the idea is you're trying to promote solidarity, promote empathy for survivors, care for survivors as well. And the court emphasised really the needs to build solidarity amongst women, solidarity with survivors who are living in a region that was devastated by war. So I think this is quite an interesting and an important model of justice because it really was an attempt to try to bring survivors into post-war peace-building initiatives. So as I've mentioned, survivors played an important role in planning the Women's Court, in designing it. They took part as witnesses as well. And their testimonies really give us really important insights into women's experiences of war. So they're able to tell us about the wide range of harms that they experienced, what it was like to live through war as a civilian. They testified about, experiencing persecution on the basis of ethnic difference, religious difference, national difference. They also spoke about the experience of sexual violence in conflict and other types of harms like economic violence. In the post-war era, you had a lot of women experiencing, the loss of jobs, the loss of livelihoods, insecure employment contracts, the withdrawal of a safety net as well. State support gets withdrawn. So there's really important information, important insights that can be taken from their testimonies. And I think this is a really important contribution to justice and quite a different approach to how you achieve justice after war. I'll leave it there because I think I've probably over my time, but just to, hopefully this kind of gives you a sense of the value of the Women's Court and also the important role that survivors have played in that initiative as well.
So thank you very much, Chelsea, Linda and Maria, for three really, really interesting and eye-opening presentations. I know that I've learned a ton. Thoroughly enjoyed that. So I think we've probably got time for a couple of questions. So the one I would like to start with is, I know that we touched briefly on Holocaust and genocide denial, and certainly we see and hear a lot about Holocaust denial, but not so much about genocide denial when talking about some of the other genocides that have taken place more recently. How dangerous do you think genocide denial is, and kind of the impact that has on survivors when they so frequently hear about the fact that what they went through didn't happen. I don't know who wants to start us off with that one.
I'll take a first stab at it. How about that? Yeah, I suppose the genocide denial at the end of the day is often part of a attempt to mischaracterize national past in a certain way that props up the politics or the political agenda of a certain group of people who often hold discriminatory or exclusive viewpoints. And so I think it is very dangerous. But I'm going to stop talking and allow somebody else to talk more about the importance that might have upon survivors. We've got
come in at that point then.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Seamless transition there. I think it is incredibly dangerous because denial dehumanizes, and they've already been through an incredibly dehumanizing experience, and it's just reinforcing of that. And as I saw when mentioned in my research, it was denial from other people, even if it wasn't intended as denial of the genocide. It was incredibly painful for those survivors, and it stopped them talking. And if it stops them talking, then it stops justice happening as well, because people think, I just don't want to be involved in that because they're not going to take me seriously. Denial inhibits justice, it stops justice happening, and it prevents reconciliation. And as we know, the vast majority of perpetrators are going to get out of prison if they ever get sent to prison in the first place. So we need to think about, well, what happens to those people afterwards? And if denial is allowed to flourish, as it often does, then all that means is that those perpetrators can basically even not get prosecuted, but if they do get prosecuted, come back and basically continue the denial and say, well, it was a wrongful conviction, I wasn't involved, it wasn't genocide, and so on. So I think it's the problem. Genocide is a fact. It happens. It has happened in the past, and we can discuss and debate the motivations and the impacts of it, but we cannot deny the fact it happened. And when people do deny the fact it happens, it has massive impacts on society as a whole, but particularly survivors, because it's so easily done, because it's often a key to unlock a door to a bigger issue. So it's used as a way of getting a message across that's bigger. So Holocaust denial isn't just about denying the Holocaust, it's about getting through to the idea that Jews control the world. So it's those types of things that come across, and it's the same with Bosnian or Rwandan denial. It's about using that as a vehicle to get through to a bigger issue that usually politicians want control of.
Just to add to that, if you think about the situation in Srebrenica and the fact that there are still a lot of families that are still waiting to find out, what happened to their loved ones, right? There are still a lot of families that haven't found out where the remains of their loved ones are buried. So there's a lot of silence, there's denial, people don't want to talk. So that has a material impact on those families, doesn't it? Because the more that there's silence and the more that there's denial, the less likelihood that they're able to find out where the remains are buried, where their bones are buried, and to allow them to have, a funeral. And it also creates a lot of stress for survivors as well, doesn't it? When you have people denying what took place. And it threatens processes of return as well. So you have people who have been forcibly displaced. They're less likely to return to their homes, their communities that lived in before the genocide, and live there if they can see that their neighbours and people in the local community don't support them, that they're denying that crimes took place. So there are lots of different reasons why genocide denial is a real problem and needs to be challenged.
Thank you. I am going to follow that up with one final question, sticking on the theme of genocide denial. What do you think we as individuals can do to combat genocide denial? It's such a huge topic. People don't always feel that they necessarily have the background knowledge to speak in depth about the impact of it, but are there things that we can do as individuals, even to have some sort of small impact, to try and combat this really dangerous rhetoric that is so prevalent still?
I can start if you want. I was just thinking that I know it's already been mentioned by others, but education I think is really important. So it's important to learn about the genocide. It's important that it's taught in schools and colleges and universities. But also more than that, I think it's important that we all develop kind of critical thinking tools as well, because that helps us to think about, you know, what are these narratives? Where do they come from? Assess the claims, the evidence that people are putting forward to try to justify their position. So I think education is really important. It helps us to identify, you know, are these denials and these kind of counterclaims, these conspiracy theories, where are they coming from? Are they linked to powerful institutions in society and so on? So I think education is a really important tool to help us to think about why it is that genocide denial happens, it is present, and also to help us to kind of counter it as well.
Yeah, just building off of what Maria has said, I think that education is clearly one of the most important key ways of combating genocide denial, as well as to allowing us as a collective to become better and more aware of what's going on. But from like a standpoint of what the individual can do on a daily basis, I think from my perspective, it's question. If you see something you don't understand, whether it's a social media post, for example, or some kind of other political argument, or even if just like a term, like, you know, you don't know what Biafra means, you know, go and look it up. You know, this is what's amazing. We've got the power of Wikipedia at our fingertips, although that's not the best source, obviously, but we've got the power of very many search tools. And so, you know, from an individual standpoint, question everything that you read, question what people say, and, you know, and educate yourself. If you don't know a term, you don't know what that means, so go and find out and learn. There's a lot of really good sources out there. You know, for Holocaust denial specifically, and Holocaust distortion, I mean, it's shocking. The statistics are awful. For example, 20% of French respondents to one survey by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance just like 2 years ago, 20% of French respondents between the ages of 18 and 34 said they had never heard of the Holocaust. So if they just could look that term up, they would find out, you know, and then boom, they're not part of that statistic anymore. So small things.
Education is definitely key, both as a sort of a national global situation, but also on the individual level, and just going out and reading the stuff. And there's lots of video testimonies online from various organizations that you can go listen to and hear the testimonies of those survivors and hear what they went through. So you don't have to go to someone and tell me all your horrible secrets. But also it's about, I know, for example, the Holocaust is compulsory on the national curriculum, but if you're an academy, you don't have to follow the national curriculum. And given that the government has academized, for, I think, about 80% of schools, that means they don't have to teach that if they don't want to. And many teachers feel uncomfortable teaching it because they're not confident in their own knowledge. So there needs to be a push there as well, not just about the Holocaust, but about wider genocides as well. And the quality of education around genocide and Holocaust, particularly in schools, is really variable. You get some who are beacon schools who do a really, really good job educating about the Holocaust, and then you've got other schools who put Schindler's List on for 3 lessons and that's it. And there's everything in between those things. So there needs to be a consistent approach in schools, not just about what happened, but about the implications for this, and particularly around denial. And I think that's why a lot of teachers are very wary of teaching it, is because they're worried about people saying, oh, well, my dad says the Holocaust didn't happen, or my dad says, you know, they deserved it, or, you know, that sort of thing. And how do you manage those responses in the classroom? So it's a challenging topic to teach, but it requires teachers who are passionate about their topic. And it doesn't just have to come from history, and it should be embedded throughout all the curriculum in terms of, you know, you can look at literature from the Holocaust, from Rwanda and from Bosnia. You can look at, you know, political situations. You can look at it through citizenship, through PSHE. There's lots of different opportunities to teach it. But unless we, because I didn't learn about the Holocaust at school. I have no recollection of learning about the Holocaust. I did learn about Bradford Wool Exchange I'm very good on that, which now Waterstones, but I didn't learn about the Holocaust at school. And so I ended up learning about it as part of my teacher training when I was learning to teach at school, but that was only because I went off and did that myself. So other teachers will have that same experience of particularly going through the education system as I did during the 80s, just didn't get taught about it. And even now what we're seeing is teachers dropping off teaching it because it's challenging, because the curriculum is so packed that they don't really have any space to include things and give it the time that it needs.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you all for a really, really interesting set of presentations. Apologies to the audience that we didn't manage to get through more questions, but I hope it's given everyone a lot to go away and think about. Thank you so much to our three brilliant speakers. I know I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you to the Holocaust Centre North for collaborating and helping host this event, and for Hannah for all of your help. And thank you very much everyone for attending. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much for inviting us. It's been wonderful.